Avatars in video games play a key role in player engagement, and in most modern AAA games an avatar is required for the game to play out. In games, an avatar is defined as a character or creature that you create to represent yourself in a computer game. In other words, the character is a representation of you. However, I would argue that this is not always the case, and that oftentimes the dissonance between the self and the character is intentional. Perhaps the most famous example of this is in Spec Ops: The Line. The game begins as a typical first-person shooter, but at a certain point in the story, the player character inadvertently bombs a civilian shelter with white phosphorus because the enemy soldiers had moved them there thinking it would be safe. When the player character sees this, he blames the enemy terrorist organization rather than himself, despite it essentially being his own fault.
We need to keep moving.
What?
Reinforcements will be here any second. We need to keep moving.
But Walker, you're not even...
I'm gonna make these bastards pay for what they've done. Now, are you with me or not?
From this point onwards, the player is forced to play as this man who continues to act more and more questionably, until the player would no longer have any reason to align themselves with the character, and yet has to continue playing the game. The game is often linked to the concept of ludonarrative dissonance, meaning instances in video games that present a conflict between narrative and gameplay. In the case of Spec Ops, the gameplay is like any other shooter game, but the narrative suggests hypocrisy in the player character, and this is the contradiction behind the game that makes it so powerful. The more the player participates, the more they sympathize with their character's enemies, the same enemies they're being made to kill.
You brought this on yourself.
We were helping.
Another example of a divide between player and avatar is in Grand Theft Auto V's torture sequence. Some ways through the game, the player takes on the persona of Trevor, the game's meta-commentary / audience surrogate, as well as being one of the 3 protagonists in the game. The player is made to torture a man for information on a target until you have the sufficient intel. I found this scene to be uncomfortable when first playing through it, and even in recording the footage for this part, I still find it an uncomfortable experience to sit through. I remember when I first played, I chose to waterboard the subject at each stage, thinking it would cause the least lasting damage of the options. Although I later found out that it can damage your lungs and give you brain damage, so never mind. Although I was being given no choice, I still felt guilt towards the subject. On one hand, this could be considered me inhabiting the character as an avatar, since I felt emotion towards a character and acted in ways that I would want to if it were real. However, the fact that the character is actively enjoying torturing the man rules out the possibility of avatar inhabitants for me.
Got beer. He smokes like a fucking chimney.
I don't know. Trev, maybe one more time? Just to be sure.
No, please, no. I told you, he smokes. That's all I know.
Interestingly, this doesn't seem to be as clean cut as I would assume. For every person I've spoken to about this scene that feels the same way that I do, I've heard people laugh about the scene and say they enjoyed it. Whether this is avatar inhabitants or separation is unclear. Despite its PEGI 18 rating, the scene was quite controversial at the time, and is particularly problematic when you consider that the sequence is mandatory to continue the story. Instead of relegating the mission to a side objective, the developers made it a requirement to complete. The scene serves as a satirical critique of torture as a whole, much as most things in the game are critiques of some aspect of society. As well as this, the scene underlines Trevor as a character who chooses to gleefully continue the torture despite the subject openly offering information anyway.
You're a torture advocate!
Advocate?
The media and the government would have us believe that torture is some necessary thing. We needed to get information, to assert ourselves. Did we get any information out of you?
I would have told you everything!
Exactly!
In an essay on digital subjects and identity, Rob Gallagher claims that digital subjects express themselves via autobiographical performances and acts of self-presentation. But can these instances really be considered as such? In both cases outlined, the player is forced into an uncomfortable experience in which their thoughts are contradicted by their avatar. I doubt many people would consider themselves to be pro-torture after playing Grand Theft Auto, much less say that their identity is determined by their behavior as Trevor. The character is distinct from the player, and that distinction is essentially what makes these games interesting experiences.